We're continuing on with the conversation of The Secret Team by General Fletcher Prouty, pages 129 forward. 30-minute interval discussing the secret team and the CIA corruption from a 31-year participant in this organization or career in the FBI, whatever, CIA. The main thing is that it is done skillfully and under the heavy veil of secrecy. Many key CIA career men have served in such slots as agents operating within the United States government. There's no question about the fact that some of these agents have been the most influential, productive agents in the CIA, and there is no doubt that the security measures utilized to cover these agents within our own government have been heavier than those used between the United States and other governments. Thus, the CIA has been able to evolve a change in the meaning of and the use of the control word direct, and then to get its own people into key positions so that when they do present operations for approval, they're often presenting these critical clandestine schemes to their own people. The Pentagon Papers detail much of this, and we shall discuss it later. One reason why Bundy appears too frequently in the Pentagon paper is because he was a long-time career CIA man, and he was used as a conduit by the CIA to get its schemes for Vietnam to and past such men as McNamara and Rusk. In this manner, Dulles worked to create a role for the Army black sheep, Taylor. It was in Dulles' interest to get Taylor into the White House, and it is very much in Taylor's personal interest to get back into a position where he expected to be able to press some of his old ideas, or what was most likely where he would be useful as the front man for some of his former staffers. Taylor's approach, when confronted with an explanation or a proposal that varied from his own, was usually a brusque, "Get on the team." In other words, if you were not with him, you were against him, and if you were not on the team, you would be dropped summarily. Many a good Army officer of that era was brushed aside simply because he had tried to point out other views than those held by Taylor. In Taylor's book, The Uncertain Trumpet, he cites his method of operation when he is in opposition to the chairman of the JCS and the other chiefs. I arrived carefully prepared with a written rebuttal drawn up with the help of some of my ablest staff officers. I took the offensive at the start of the session, attacking the unsoundness of the proposal from all points of view, military, political, and fiscal. On the face of it, there was nothing wrong with such a method, and all of the chiefs do that, and General Taylor made a career of charging into meetings with a written rebuttal of some of his firebrand of officers and of getting knocked flat on his face. This would not be so unimportant an observation if I had not witnessed JCS meetings with and without General Taylor present at the time when he was chairman himself. It would not have become so public a bit of information if some of these written works that he cites had not published in all their unbelievable candor in the Pentagon Papers. Goa's statement that there is nothing more frightful than ignorance in action. Black Lives Matter. Social media influencer. Celebrity. Shall I go on? May be very true, and we have the war in Vietnam to prove it. The statement can be topped. There's nothing so frightful and so self-righteous as an otherwise intelligent and experienced man to serve his own ends will champion the cause of the ignorant in action. That would be the good people within what I just said, because there are good somewhat. No, some. They're also on a version of the secret team. Allen Dulles was able to get Maxwell Taylor into the White House as personal military advisor to President Kennedy. There was much public discussion about the propriety of placing a general in such a capacity in the White House, ostensibly overseeing and perhaps second-guessing the lawful chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The CIA and its cake to keep and to eat on this point, because not only did it gain Maxwell Taylor as a principal ally at the seat of power, but it finessed a good share of the Bay of Pigs blame upon the JCS without so much saying so. Most people were willing to read into these key appointments what they thought was the president's own view, that there must be something to the allegations that the JCS botched up the Bay of Pigs if Kennedy himself, with all he knew after the investigation, brought General Maxwell Taylor into that White House to keep an eye on the military. It must have delighted Taylor to let the rumors and the conjecture fly. He could play it either way. He could second-guess the chairman, General Levenser, as capable a chairman as there has ever been, or he could settle down to his role of advancing ST schemes along with his newly won friends, the U.S. Army Special Forces and Green Berets. This sort of army was much to his liking, and this sort of army was already up to its neck in operations with the CIA. Maxwell Taylor was not the White House military advisor in the regular sense. He is the CIA's man at the White House, and he is a preliminary advisor. Though through all of this board of inquiry investigation, Allen Dulles orchestrated the rest of the committee members into his plan. Burke, without question, the ablest admiral to serve as chief of naval operations since World War II, had chaired many JCS meetings during the period when the Bay of Pigs operation was being developed, and since much of the planning involved the Navy and the Marine Corps. The top military man on the CIA staff was a most able and experienced Marine colonel. He was a logical member of the JCS to sit on the committee. His position on the committee, however, must have caused him quite a bit of concern because as he witnessed the unfolding of the operation as Dulles unwound the scheme, he must have wondered if what he was hearing in that room could possibly have been anything to do with the operational information that he had heard during the briefings. One of the really secret techniques of the ST is to cellularize and play by ear the development of some scheme. Just to let you know that everyone falls in love with me. Everyone. I have curly hair. Everyone falls in love with me. Just to let you know. Sometimes schemes backfire and the good win when the scheme is rotten. However, it's all perspective and perceptions, especially when the heart is at risk. They don't have a soul, so they don't quite understand companionship and true love and stuff like that. So that's that. It would be hard to say that they planned it that way because one of the things that the team understands and practices the least is planning. But as an operation develops, they assign one part of it to one group and another part to another group. At certain levels of the hierarchy, these come together. It would be nice if such things were done with PERT chart of network charting, precision, and effectiveness, but they are not. So as an operation develops, it grows haphazardly. When the CIA needs something from the Navy, it will be a certain man call upon a naval focal point office and request the item. Depending on how easy this detail is put over, the briefer may or may not tell the Navy that what he plans to do with it. The Navy may press him and say, in effect, "We cannot send 2 Navy doctors on temporary duty to Panama for Project XYZ unless you tell us exactly what Project XYZ is and why you need 2 Navy doctors." The Navy knows that if the doctors were to be used on an Army post, this would not look right, even in Panama, and the Navy might be left holding the bag in the event the operation were to be compromised. At this point, the CIA might tell the Navy the real story, or he might tell them a cover story, a lie, and see if they can get away with it. In either case, if the focal point officer is doing his job, he will gain sufficient time to call upon the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations to mention this request to be cleared of executive officer there. At this point, the executive officer may or may not choose to inform the CNO or the Chief of Navy Operations. In this rather hit and miss manner, the CNO, in this case Admiral Burke, may or may not have gotten a thorough briefing on the whole Bay of Pigs operation. Since no one else did, it would be surprising if Admiral Burke did. Furthermore, as he filled in for General Lemnitzer only from time to time, he could not possibly have ever received a full and comprehensive Bay of Pigs briefing in his capacity as member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This is not to say that the JCS may not have demanded and then have received a formal briefing. The JCS did have a briefing of sorts during 1961 in January, just before the Kennedy inauguration. It was their one-time introduction to what the CIA was doing, but such briefings are themselves not comprehensive. They suffer first of all from limitations of the briefing officers, who may not know all that is being done, and who for their own parts have not been told all this is underway. Therefore, even though someone is someone as important as a member of the JCS may insist upon a briefing in full, the very fact that he is so important will embolden the ST to endeavor to give as little information as they are pressed to serve up, because they can serve. He has been too busy to become familiar with all the prior activity. As a result, it would be surprising if Admiral Burke could have recognized a little more than 1/3 of what he heard during the committee meeting in those hectic days in the Pentagon of April and May of 1961. Furthermore, Allen Dulles had other trump cards. Not one of the committee, and few people, if any, anywhere, really knew who all the responsible men were at the core of this operation. It's a very excellent book, The Bay of Pigs. Hayes Johnson tells us of his interviews with the Cubans to find out what they were asked at these meetings and what they said in these meetings, but he found no one else with whom he could discuss the operation. He did not know whom to ask, and no one else would know the right ones either. Allen Dulles was not at all interested in bringing to the committee hearings the men responsible for and most familiar with the operation. As a matter of fact, as far as he was concerned, that operation was over. It was a mess. It was not to be resurrected. He arranged those hearings so that Maxwell Taylor and Bobby Kennedy could hear as much as possible about the ways and the means of the ST, not in the past, but in the future. As a result, Dulles marched an endless column of men in and out of the committee rooms who had either nothing or very little to do with the real Bay of Pigs operation. The most important thing was that the whole host of men who had a lot to do with the operation were completely ignored. Again, using the need-to-know principle, Dulles would do more by excluding knowledge men from the meetings, and that he could be by parading platoons of men who knew only one phase or another. Typical of the style of questioning was that with General Taylor discussed with certain Cubans that tactics they had used on the beach. This led to a wider discussion of Green Berets and paramilitary type tactics, and of a military role in civic action programs. All of this away from the main project subject. Mr. Dulles found in his patient hands some putty in the form of Bobby Kennedy and Maxwell Taylor. No one should underestimate the role played by Kennedy. Nothing in its strenuous career had prepared him to become a military strategist or battlefield tactician. But few men in this country were more experienced in the ways of the government, and few men were tougher than Bobby Kennedy. He may have won over on the Green Beret side because of that stage of development. Their doctrine was uncluttered by later horrible events in Vietnam, and because this doctrine was an idealistic mix of Boy Scouts, military, government, and Red Cross. But the evidence is that Bobby Kennedy was not misled in his appraisal of the real problems underlying the serious and tragic failure of the Bay of Pigs operation. He came very close to seeing how terribly significant the real meaning of clandestine operations is, and how gross an impact the failure of such operations can have upon national prestige and credibility. It is entirely possible that John Kennedy lived to serve until re-elected sometime during the administration. The genie of clandestine operations would have been put back into the bottle, and the CIA might have been returned to its legally authorized role of an intelligence agency and no more. The committee hearings ended in May of 1961. No report of these hearings has ever been published. It is possible that if it were to be published, it would be a most misleading document. It would contain all manner of irrelevant testimony, and it would be devoid of solid inside information. However, somewhere in the inner sanctum of the Kennedy White House, were some hard-hitting and valuable meetings concerning the future of clandestine operations by the United States government. These meetings must have been attended only by the Kennedy family team, not by the president's official staff. Out of these meetings came three most interesting and remarkable documents. Kennedy did not utilize the structure NSC he inherited from Eisenhower, yet from time to time he had to issue very important directives that affected the national security. Thus, he issued what were called National Security Action Memorandum by June of 1961. Some 50 or more such memorandum had been published, and the Department of Defense had established procedures for the processing and implementation of these major directives. Then, shortly after the Bay of Pigs Committee had completed its hearings, the White House issued three NSAM of the most unusual and revolutionary nature. They prescribed vastly limiting stipulations upon the conduct of clandestine operations. NSAM number 55 was addressed to the chairman of the JCS, and its principal theme was to instruct the chairman of the President of the United States held him responsible for all military type actions, operations in peacetime, as he would be responsible for them in time of war. Because of the semantic problems inherent in dealing with this subject, it is not always possible to be as precise in writing about clandestine operations as one might like to be. But there were no misunderstandings the full intent and weight of this document. Peacetime operations as used in this context were always clandestine operations. The radical turn of this memorandum came from the fact that the president was charging the chairman with his responsibility. It did not say that the chairman should develop such operations. In fact, accompanying directives clarified the issue to mean that clandestine operations were to cease, or at least to be much restricted. What it did do was to charge the chairman with providing the president with advice and counsel on any such developments. The NSAM therefore put into the chairman's hands the authority to demand full and comprehensive briefings and an inside role during the development of any clandestine operations in which the U.S. government might become involved. The usual NSAM was assigned by one of the senior members of the White House staff and was changed from time to time depending upon the subject of the directive and addressee. NSAM number 55 was the most singular in that it was addressed only to the chairman of the JCS with an information addressee notation for the DCI, the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of Defense, and this order was assigned personally by President John F. Kennedy. There was to be no doubt in the minds of any of the inner group of the Kennedy administration concerning the president's meaning and intentions. The fact that the DCI received this copy as information was alone sufficient to heavily underscore the president's message. Coming as it did on the heels of the committee's intensive, though inconclusive and somewhat misleading investigations, this document, more than any other, emphatically underlined the importance of the role of Bobby Kennedy. He may not have been a passive member of the committee as he soaked up the action, but if nothing came more out of the hearings than this presence on the committee would have been well worthwhile. It had become clear that the Kennedys had to be their inner family, that CIA lack of leadership in the Bay of Pigs had been the cause of its failure. The total lack of the on-the-spot tactical leadership with the first element Kennedy attacked once the hearings had concluded. This document, more than anything else, sealed the fate of Dick Bissell and Allen Dulles. When the chips were down, there had not been there, nor had they made their presence felt. NASM number 56 was not a significant document and was more intended to fill a small chink in the leaking dam than to reroute the whole stream of events. But what it lacked in thunder was more than made up. NSAM number 55, we have been saying much about clandestine operations and of the very peculiar nature of the type of business. When it has all been reviewed, one of the principal conclusions must be that the United States government is inherently and operationally incapable of developing and successfully carrying out clandestine operations, primarily because they run at total opposites to our basic way of life. Americanism means an open society, and clandestine operations are the desperate efforts to closed society. Fletcher Neville is an excellent and very popular book. Vanished has his principal character, President Rhoda Bush, say after a heated session with the DCI, Arthur Ingram, "We've been over this ground before. He can't see that if we adopt communist methods in our zeal to contain them, we wind up defeating ourselves, war or no war. What is left is our open society if every man has to fear a secret government agent at his elbow. Who can respect us or believe us? We have no way of knowing whether or not Neville and Kennedy in mind as his fictional president. But if he had been a member of the inner Kennedy team, that at that time he would have come up with a more topical comment. Kennedy knew that he had been badly burned by the Bay of Pigs incident, and by June of 1961, he and Bobby knew that he had been let down by the ST. I carefully switched to the ST label here because, in all fairness to the CIA, it was more than the CIA that really created the unfortunate operation. For example, the overeager blind participation of certain military elements gave the whole operation a weird and unbalanced character, which doomed it before it got off the ground. Then the lack of leadership, which really is the name of the game in clandestine operations, provided the coup de grace. It was the whole ST that built a totally unexpected and totally unplanned operation of the smaller, more nearly clandestine units that might have had some measures of success. Therefore, Kennedy did feel and did know that such clandestine operations had no place in the U.S. government. distracted by somebody who was trying to abuse someone, but it's hysterical. And it has to do with teeth, which is always the funny stuff, right? Let's see, where we at? We got 10 minutes left. 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, look, patents in this chapter. We may have this video in another chapter. I think I'll be able to finish chapter 4. This led him to direct the publication of the most important of these 3 memoranda. NSAM number 55, NSAM number 57 was a long paper as those things go, and we shall make no attempt to recall it in great detail. When the Pentagon Papers series was published by the New York Times, it was noticeably for its omission. It is the sort of educated omission that makes the Pentagon Papers suspect in the eyes of those who have been most intimately connected with the type of work. Any gross batch of documents can be made to mean one thing or quite another, not only by what the news media publishes, but by the way they delete from publication. Let's focus on this, finishing this, and then we will work on the other 2 objectives. There's actually 4 objectives. Objective 1, objective 2, objective 3 is walking, objective 4 is a yoga practice. NSAM number 57 is a controversial document that has not been released to date. The principle behind NSAM number 57 is absolutely fundamental to the whole concept of clandestine operations. It not only restates the idea that clandestine operations should be secret and deniable, but it goes beyond that to state that they should be small. It plays on the meaning of small in 2 areas of interest. First, unless they are very small, they should not be assigned to the CIA. And second, if they are not as small as possible, they have no chance of remaining secret, therefore no chance, by definition, of being successful clandestine operations. This latter issue flies right in the face of the CIA, which had been working for years to define all sorts of operations, large and small, secret or not, as clandestine, in order that they would then, by arbitrary definition, be assigned to the CIA. This was an erosion of the principle, but it had been going on for so long that the CIA had used the game so blatantly for so long that it had become almost a matter of course. The CIA managed to declare in 1962 that the training of the Border Patrol Police of the India-China border had a clandestine activity. Then, because it was clandestine, the whole job was assigned to the CIA. The CIA got itself deeply involved in the Cantonese side of the Congo venture. It defined its work as clandestine to keep it under agency control, whereas everyone in Africa and most of the world knew that Cantonese did not have the clout to operate huge C-97 4-engine Boeing transport aircraft and the other aircraft that became immediately mysteriously available. Shombi. It becomes ridiculous to equate activities in Indochina to any useful definition of clandestine, yet the CIA continued to clamp high security classification on what it was doing there simply to that agency could remain in control of the things it had stirred up. In Vietnam, this became so blatant and such a big business that the United States government has always had to retain an operational ambassador there, not because an ambassador could do anything to the situation, and not that the government wished to depart so far from historical administration in time of war, but because there had always been 2 equal commanding officers in Vietnam. There has always been the CIA commanding the officer, and since 1964, there has been an armed forces commanding officer. Those generals who served there before 1964 were simply figureheads, although some of them may not have fully realized that themselves, even to the end. The role of the ambassador has been to referee and arbitrate between the armed forces and the CIA. For anyone who may find this idea a bit new or rash, we should propose that he searched for a precedent for the retention of a full and active ambassador in the battle zone in a time of full war. And recall, this is by many counts the second and most costly war in all of our history. Thus, by the very size of its activities in so many areas, the CIA had exceeded all reasonable definitions of clandestine. This new Kennedy directive hit right in the most vulnerable point at the ST game at that time. No sooner had this directive been received in the Pentagon than heated arguments sprang up, wherever this order was seen, as to what what was large and what was small in clandestine activities. Oddly enough, the rather large and fast-growing contingent of the DoD officials and personnel who had found most promising and interesting niche in the special operations business were the loudest to support of small being large. In other words, they were much in support of more Bay of Pigs operations, and even by June of 1961, there had been really insignificant. In other words, they were much in support of more Bay of Pigs operations, and even by 1961 of June, there had been really significant moves of the Bay of Pigs, men and equipment from Latin America, and the bases of the United States of Vietnam. Trafficking comes up. For them, it was an onward and upward with what was a small Cuban failure or two. Indochina offered new horizons. The Democrats are allowing women to be trafficked. That's why they're also supporting toxic fake news, is because they're engaging in this seduction intercourse with trafficked women, just to let y'all know. And other stuff, including the drug trade. So when that guy was talking about on the news where he was invited to a Republican party that was like eyes wide shut, it was like that. That was a Democratic party. So everything that they're claiming upon Republicans is actually what they're up to, but they're painting the picture for if it ever comes out like a leak, to where the Republicans would occur as if they're responsible for it. However, Democrats are responsible for all of the bad junk going on. Just know that. That's how it works. There's no point in pursuing the argument further. It was never really settled anyhow. Dulles and his quietly skillful team had foreseen this possibility and had laid the groundwork to circumvent it. Opposing Dulles was like fighting your adversary on the brink of a cliff. He was willing to go over as long as he brought his opponents with him. I freaking hate this dude. He believed the handwriting on the wall, and he had sounded out the Kennedys. He knew that they had learned a lot from the Bay of Pigs, and he now knew that the Kennedys' Achilles tendon was he had told of that vital spot. So you're going to tell me you learned a lot? You learned a lot that you should have done your job? No, he learned a lot of what he could get away with. How much control he had. Or what he thought he had as control. He's such a jerk, man. It would be worth a full chapter of perhaps a full book to be able to recount in detail what really happened to NSAM number 55 and NSAM number 57. For the purpose of this account, we discount NSAM number 56. I was responsible for the action of NSAM number 55 and for whatever use it might be put to. Thus, its briefing to certain eyes-only selected senior officers can be accounted for. NSAM number 55 was briefed and in detail. It was a very short paper to the chairman of the JCS. It was red striped as the JCS terminology goes, meaning that it has read and noted by the chiefs of staff. While General Lemnitzer was the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, and while Kennedy was president, NSAM number 55 provided a strong safeguard against such things as the Bay of Pigs. If Lemnitzer was going to be responsible for the presidents for operations in peace time in the same manner as in wartime, the best way to fulfill that responsibility in the eyes of General Lemnitzer would be to have no peacetime operations. Then President Kennedy made a most significant move, one perhaps that has had more impact upon events during the past 10 years than any other that can be attributed to him or his successors. He decided to transfer General Lemnitzer to Paris to replace General Norstad as Allied commander of NATO troops. Lemnitzer was eminently classified for this task, and it was a good assignment. To replace Lemnitzer as a chairman of the JCS, Kennedy moved Maxwell Taylor from the White House to the Pentagon. By that time, the Kennedys had espoused the new doctrine of counterinsurgency and had become thoroughly wrapped up in the activities of the Special Group Counterinsurgency, as the new clandestine operations group was called. We'll finish this. I got 2.5 pages left. Although it had not been totally replaced the old special group in scope and function as an authorizing body for the clandestine affairs, it had created quite a niche for itself in the new counterinsurgency game. It used to be the anti-communist activity was carried out against communist countries, governments, and territory. There had been a gradual drift away from that. The new counterinsurgency philosophy and doctrine meant that anti-communism would now be waged in non-communist countries. Shortly after the Bay of Pigs investigation, Secretary of Defense McNamara, in conjunction with Earl Wheeler, General, who had at that time was the director of Joint Staff, agreed to establish in the Joint Staff an Office of the Special Assistant for Counterinsurgency and Special Activities. This office, among other things, worked directly with the CIA and the White House. The incumbent Marine Major General Victor Krulak became the most important and most dominant man on the staff. He carried more weight with Secretary of Defense McNamara than any other general and was always welcomed by the White House, where he frequently and most eloquently preached the new doctrine of counterinsurgency. This created an ideal platform for General Taylor. He was by that time the chief proponent of counterinsurgency in Army Greens Berets and the CIA, and the most fortuitous assignment for the CIA and the ST, he became the chairman of the JCS, and all the pieces fell into place. With George Bundy in Taylor's old job in the White House, responsible for all the clandestine activities, with Bill Bundy as the principal conduit from the CIA to McNamara later in the state, and with Taylor on top of military establishment, the ST had emerged from its nadir on the beaches of Cuba and was ready for whatever might develop in Vietnam. And to further assure his success, Kennedy's own strict directive, NSAM 55, was now in the hands of the very man who would want to use it the most and who would have the most reason to use it. Taylor. In the hands of Lemnitzer, NSAM 55 meant no more clandestine operations, or at least no more use unless there were most compelling reasons. In the hands of Maxwell Taylor, this meant that he was most willing to take full advantage of the situation and to be the president's key advisor during peacetime operations, as he would be during time of war. Lies. Meaning Taylor's a liar. One further factor played into the situation. It is quite apparent that Kennedy did not fully realize the situation he had unintentionally created. To his brother, Maxwell Taylor was a model of down-to-earth soldier. He looked like Lemnitzer, like Bradley, maybe even like Patton, only better. He was their man. They did not realize that even in his recent book, The Uncertain Trumpet, he had turned his back on the conventional military doctrine and had become a leader of new military force of response, of reaction, and of undercover activity. All summed up in a newly coined word, counterinsurgency. Kennedy was not getting an old soldier in the Pentagon. He was getting one of a new breed. Taylor's tenure would mark the end in the day of the old soldier and the beginning of the special forces, the peacetime operator. Situational. The response-motivated counterinsurgency warrior who has been so abundantly uncovered in the conflict of the past 10 years in Vietnam. This was the climax of a long bit of maneuvering within the government by the ST and its supporters. To accomplish their ends, they did not have to shoot down the Kennedy directives. NSAM number 55 and 57, in flames like the Red Baron, they simply took these memoranda over for their own ends and ignored them when they were in conflict with whatever it was they wanted. They bury the opposition in security and need to know in highly classified eyes-only rules. Then, with all the top positions covered, they were in charge. They were ready to move out to whatever secret intelligence input would find a soft or intriguing spot. Historians will be amazed when and if they are ever able to find such of those basic papers. They will discover that the access list, meaning the cover lists of all those who have read the document and which are so closely guarded, will, on some of these most important papers, list only a few people, most of whom were no more than the clerks who processed the classified inventories. So very few people have ever seen the real documents and fewer have acted on them. More real control can be put on the government from the inside by not doing and not permitting to be done those things which had been instructed and directed to be done than by other conventional means. One of the best examples of this is what happened to the most important document, NSAM number 55. Nowhere else was Kennedy's strong desire for control more in evidence than in that paper than the ones that followed it. Like NSAM number 55, thus it was the events marched relentlessly on toward Vietnam. The only ones who stood in the way were the president and his close intimates, and they had been neatly outmaneuvered. That's the completion of chapter 4. We're moving on next to chapter 5. Defense, quotations, as a national military philosophy, the natural prey of the intelligence community. Ooh, that one sounds like it's going to be interesting. Who do they target? Who is their prey? Oops, I'm jumping ahead.